welcome everyone. And I see attendees are joining the room now. We're into double digits, up to 12, and more people joining as I speak. So I'll continue with a little preamble just to make sure everyone has a chance to join. Of course, this is the uh, Masterclass series, which is provided by University College Dublin, ADHD Ireland, Maynooth University, Neurodiversity Hub in Australia, and the Institute of Neurodiversity based in London. And this evening, uh, we are joined by our usual team of myself, Beth Kilkenny and Ken Kilbride, Beth being of the College of Health and Agricultural Sciences, Ken being the CEO of ADHD Ireland, and myself being a member of faculty in the School of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Systems at UCD. We're all very, very pleased indeed to welcome our guest speaker for this evening. Our guest speaker is fresh from a conference just at the weekend. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Stephen Hodnett, who is an occupational therapist who has a wealth of experience, by the way, in the area of education, having worked as a primary school teacher for over a decade in both mainstream and special educational settings. And we know the integration or otherwise of special education and supports for people requiring additional needs into mainstream schooling is a very topical point in our discourse at the moment. Stephen works with Dyspraxia or DCD Ireland as the occupational therapy coordinator of the POTS programme, which is a collaboration between Dyspraxia, DCD Ireland, and the University of Limerick. The POTS programme is a hybrid online telehealth service that provides family with goal-directed and person-centred care, while also providing high-quality student placement experiences. Stephen has a specific interest in paediatric and school-based service provision. Stephen has worked with a number of organisations on many projects and teams, including the AOTI, ILSA, DES, and regional educational centres. For our international colleagues, I know that DES is Department of Education and Science. I think AOTI is the Association of Occupational Therapists in Ireland, and I'll have to double check with Stephen if I'm right on those, and indeed ILSA. But
You're,
just
you're,
to
you're,
go on, Stephen.
you're correct. You're correct in all of those, and ILSA is the Irish Learning Support Association.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. That's a new one now for my directory. Thanks, Stephen. Stephen was heavily involved in the facilitation of the Our Say in Our Schools resource for schools from the perspective of children with dyspraxia and DCD, which was launched in November 2021, as well as the Dyspraxia DCD Ireland ADL Clinic and Resource Suite developed in 2024 and set to be launched in 2025. And, you know, Stephen's topic here this evening, Dyspraxia More Than Meets the Eye, is timely for a number of reasons. Firstly, in the Republic of Ireland, we have a new Minister for Education, and I know she has a lot of plans which will hopefully prove beneficial for all stakeholders, most especially children attending our schools. And indeed, dyspraxia or DCD is a vital area which I think deserves focus and recognition. So we were thrilled when Beth reached out to Stephen, and you answered our call, Stephen. So thanks for joining us. And thanks indeed to our viewers as well, joining us from across the globe, either live or indeed on playback. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. A lovely introduction. And thanks again for hosting me today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak. So I suppose we'll get going and have a look through some of the content. There'll be some activities that may involve a pen and paper or any form of writing if you so wish to engage in it. So if you want to grab that quickly, that's no problem. what we're going to start with is just kind of looking at the contents of our talk for today. I'm going to give an overview of dyspraxia DCD and look at some of the kind of definitions around the diagnosis and the area. We're going to look at some of the strengths of individuals with dyspraxia DCD and the impact that it can have on an individual. We're going to look at, of course, the physical side of things, but then also the non-physical areas that can be impacted as a result of having dyspraxia DCD. And then we might have a little bit of time to have a quick chat about regulation and the idea of task analysis. So the kind of goals for today would be that you'll have a greater understanding of dyspraxia DCD, that you will have a knowledge of some strengths that may be associated with individual dyspraxia DCD, which I'm sure you'll see across multiple groups. And then that you'll have developed a greater awareness of the non-physical components of dyspraxia DCD. Just before we start, I have 4 questions here just to have a quick reflection, a self-reflection for yourselves in relation to, and you can write them down if you want, you can keep them in your heads, that's up to you. We won't be asking for you to show them or share them. But just have a think about for yourself, what is DCD? Do I know? What's my understanding? Who are the type of people it affects? How does it present in these people? How does it affect these people? And then what kind of impact on day-to-day function might it have? So I'm just going to give 30 seconds at the start to frame your thinking on today, and we'll review it at the very end then also. So as I said, you can do it either formally and write it down, or informally and just have a think about it for yourself. So maybe we'll give you another 10 seconds and then we might move on. And again, there's no right or wrong answer in this. This is just a reflection piece. So we're just going to move on now. So I suppose the first piece is, what is dyspraxia DCD? Dyspraxia DCD is a condition that affects physical coordination, which can cause an individual to perform less well than expected in daily activities for their age, and at times appear more clumsy or less fluid in movement. The predominant characteristics would be gross and fine motor proficiency, or just so gross meaning big body movements, fine meaning precise and smaller body movements, normally of the hand, and then that they impact function. So boiling it down really to, it's how our brain gives our messages to our body and how those messages are interacted or completed. And that would be kind of the key component that we would see, how those messages are different to what we might expect. As you may be aware, I'm using the term dyspraxia DCD interchangeably. And one of the questions I often get is it dyspraxia? Is it DCD? What is the correct terminology? So DCD stands for Developmental Coordination Disorder, and that is the official diagnosis that will be used internationally and would appear in the DSM-5, which is the official diagnostic handbook, or one of the official diagnostic handbooks. You'll see the term DCD in anything in literature, in relation to diagnosis, in relation to educational pieces. That is where the term DCD would be used. Some people, particularly in countries maybe such as Canada, use the term DCD exclusively to represent the condition. Other countries and other people sometimes use the term dyspraxia. And dyspraxia is, for some people, it's a much more neuroaffirmative term. It is linked closely with other diagnoses, and as well, it doesn't have the word disorder in it, which can be a lot more affirming for some people. In other places, then dyspraxia can be considered more a layperson's terms, and in some countries, it's not used at all. So for this talk, they'll be used interchangeably. When we look at what a diagnosis looks like, or what the criteria are for a diagnosis of dyspraxia DCD, the key areas we look for is motor coordination difficulties or differences that then impact on function and the ability to complete daily tasks, that this presents from an early age throughout the lifespan, and that there's no other condition that would be responsible for the coordination differences. So we've already mentioned the idea of dyspraxia or DCD and how that might look. When we look at dyspraxia, we mentioned there that it needs to be throughout the lifespan. People do not grow out of this disorder. It's not something that you have as a young child and do all your exercises that your teacher or T recommends, and all of a sudden it's not there or present. It's something that will be there throughout the lifespan, though individuals learn techniques and strategies just to work through that. When we look at the statistics of the prevalence, there's a lot of variation in this. And the largest scale research was done by the American Psychiatric Association 12 years ago, which highlighted between 5 to 6%. So in and around 1 in 20 people presented or had DCD, though more recent estimations might highlight that up to 8% of the population may actually have DCD, and that is contributable to not being diagnosed due to varied symptoms and varied presentations. One interesting statistic here is that 3 to 1 male to female. And just to clarify that, that does not mean that three times as many men have DCD. What we're actually looking at here is the diagnostic rate, that 3 times as many males are diagnosed than females are diagnosed. What this means is that there could be a link towards more males being more likely to have dyspraxia DCD, but what we generally see is that there's a much more likely for males to be diagnosed, to be picked up, to be screened and seen as potentially having dyspraxia DCD, and then assessed rather than females who, for a number of multitude of different reasons, are less likely to be diagnosed or to be assessed for diagnosis. What's two interesting points here at the end, there's very high rates of co-occurrence of dyspraxia DCD and other neurodiverse needs. So the research shows that if you have a diagnosis of DCD, there's a 40% chance, or 2 in 5, almost 50% chance that you would have a second diagnosis. One of the really interesting points I find is that dyspraxia does not impact intelligence. Research shows that people with dyspraxia DCD generally, on average, will have average to above average intelligence in line with the typical population. Though research also shows that people with dyspraxia DCD are less likely to experience academic achievement due to a multitude of areas, including writing, typing speed, those kind of areas, one component, but then also the executive functioning, planning, and study areas that may impact those side of things. When we consider the concept of dyspraxia DCD, if you know one person with DCD, that is exactly who and what you know. You know one person with dyspraxia DCD. We often hear, I'm sure you're familiar in many of your own fields, people trying to group by topics, by characteristics, by personality. But in fact, when you know one person with DCD, that is exactly what you know. You've met one person and heard one person speak. That is it. When we talk about dyspraxia DCD, it's important to remember that there's not levels of dyspraxia DCD, that there's not a case of saying I have grade 1 or grade 2 or specific area impacted, those type of things. It is either you meet the threshold or not. Each individual is then affected and impacted differently, that some may have very specific fine and gross motor needs, some may have less, so may have more core coordination difficulties, or maybe crossing the midline, or bimanual using 2 hands differences. So again, it's going to impact different people differently. For example, on the previous slide, we saw catwalk model and actress Cara Delevingne, who walks in very high heels, who's reported to present with dyspraxia DCD. We have international rugby players like Ed Skenge, who plays for England in rugby union, who has openly discussed his dyspraxia. So again, it's not something that would stop you doing anything. It's just something that may make it more difficult, or may result in you needing to find a different way to do it. When we look at supports for people with dyspraxia DCD, it's always going to be based on person-centered and need, that each person will have a different opinion of what they need for support or what they would like support with. And we try not to give any blanket resources that cover multiple areas, that we look at each person on their merits. So what we're going to have a look at next is a quick activity involving signatures. So what I would like everyone to do, if you're comfortable doing it, is to get a piece of paper or whatever piece of writing material you have, and a pencil, pen, and I want you to just write your signature. And I do not want you to share it on the camera or on the screen with anyone. All I want is for you to complete your signature with your normal dominant hand that you normally use to write, and just scribble it down on a piece of paper. And as I said, we won't be sharing that at all. Perfect. So once you have that completed, I want you to swap the hand that you are holding the pen in. So you should put the pen in the hand you don't normally write with. And I want you to try your best, again, no one else is going to see it, this is just for you, to try and do your signature with that hand. I'm going to allow a little bit more time for that one. Okay, as best as you can. It doesn't need to be perfect. Next, I want you to put the pen back in your dominant hand, so the hand you normally write with. And I want you to try your best to copy this signature. And don't worry, it's not my signature. You're not getting into my bank account with that one. So I want you just to copy this generic signature as best you can with your dominant hand. And I'll give you maybe 10, 15 seconds to just make an attempt on that. Perfect. So what we're looking at here is a number of different processes. When we write our signature with our dominant hand, it's probably most likely going to be a passive cognitive process where we don't need to place a whole pile of cognitive energy into doing it. We don't need to overthink it. We don't need to plan movements. That's our natural movement. There's really strong neural pathways from our brain and central nervous system into our hand. We know how to hold that pen. We're comfortable with it. And that's a really fluid process. When we switch to our non-dominant hand, this is the hand that potentially has weaker muscles from less use, has less neural pathways and less clear cognition and strategy on how to work that hand. The process is definitely more active because we have to think about how to do it and where we're starting. It's also counterintuitive because we're writing in across the body in a different manner. And also there's going to be a different starting point from where our visuals can see it, but also where we physically look at it. These are all things that we may see for someone with dyspraxia DCD when they're trying to plan a movement. And what's really interesting then I find is when we look at the transcription of the signature here in front of you. When we complete that, even though we're using our dominant hand, so all the biomechanical factors that were there, so anything to do with hand strength, hand positioning, pencil grip, pen grip, whatever you're working with, that's all the same as when we're signing our signature. But for this one, it's no longer those biomechanical neural pathways that are concerned. This is much more cognitive. The areas that we need to look at is, firstly, we're looking at the shape of it. Then we look at the starting point. Then we're trying to recreate movements. We're looking at line direction, line shape, or then we're controlling our body and reacting to do this. And then we're looking at where it stops and we have to start again. And this becomes a much more challenging process because the sequencing is different. The way in which our brain interacts with the process is different. And also it becomes a much more active process. And that is something that we see quite regularly for people with dyspraxia DCD. As we said, there's nothing that they can't do. There's things that may be more difficult, but what we very regularly see is motor coordination or motor sequencing tasks. So doing tasks, our brain telling our body what to do can be challenging. When we see this, I take the example of tying my shoelace. I could be speaking to you all now and I could tie my shoelace underneath my desk without thinking too much. It wouldn't be very professional of me to do, but it is something I could do with quite little cognitive reserve required in a passive action. For someone with dyspraxia DCD, it'll be much more active, much more consideration goes into that movement, and those thought processes, those planning, that sequencing will require much more effort. So what we see is then for these people that quite regularly they can complete all these day-to-day tasks, but they become much more fatigued much more easily as a result of having to put those extra minute, 2 minutes, which all add up in the day to hours in the day into processes that we may take for granted. Before we go looking into any of the impacts, I want to have a quick look at, say, the strengths of individuals, because I'm sure every group of people have different strengths and activities. And again, when you know one person with DCD, that's what you know one person. But these are the ones that would be most prevalent and would come up in research when we look at things like creativity and outside the box thinking, problem solving, good work ethic and determination, honest and caring and empathetic individuals, those who present more effectively orally than maybe through written product, and then also quite enthusiastic around different. So it's really nice. The softer skills can really shine through in this group, but again, that's not for everyone, and we won't try and say it is. When we look at those areas that we most commonly see being impacted for individuals with DCD or dyspraxia, we look into these two areas, primary, secondary. And that doesn't mean primary school and secondary school. What we mean is primary, secondary, tertiary. Or in this case, we're saying primary is directly impacted, and then secondary is as a result of having dyspraxia DCD or living a life with dyspraxia DCD. So with the primary, we say gross motor coordination, which is our big body movements. When we talk about gross motor, we talk about big joints. So shoulders, elbows, wrists, knees, hips, all down through. Those kind of body movements fall under gross motor. Fine motor is anything to do with the hands or to do with more specific motion. Say in most cases it is the hands, some it's the feet, and sometimes it might be the tongue. But in most cases, the refined motions of the hand. Motor planning is the ability to think through an action and complete it. For example, for me, the prime example is always dancing. My ability to look at a dance move and then try and do it that's where that motor planning comes through. Sequencing of movement and knowing to do one, again, thinking about that dance, doing one step first to then flow into the second and third. That's just a kind of example there. Muscle tone can be impacted with low core muscle tone being quite regularly prevalent in people with dyspraxia DCD. We have then balance and coordination and movement can all be impacted areas. Sensory processing or ability to process information is quite regularly an area of difference. And what we see is particularly with auditory processing. And what I mean by auditory processing, for anyone that doesn't know, is the ability to take in information auditorily or through the ear. So generally, spoken word can be impacted in the rate at which that an individual can process or work through the information and make sense of it, or the volume. So maybe a certain amount of information is their threshold, and that is their capacity. Or it might be a case of the speed at which they process takes a little bit longer, but then they give a totally functional and reasonable response. And as we touched on previously, the idea of executive functioning, which is essentially the ability to plan and organize and manage oneself, including memory and all those areas, as well as the more effective skills such as stress tolerance in those areas. When we look at secondary impacts, the research highlights things such as self-esteem and self-image can be impacted as a result of having dyspraxia DCD. And what we see is that quite often young people, and adults too, don't often get those opportunities for success. If you were to describe a day-to-day school day and look at the key tasks that would be expected of an individual with dyspraxia DCD, including handwriting, sitting for long periods, following lots of auditory instructions, as we mentioned, completing fine motor-based art or science-based tasks, doesn't really provide those opportunities for success in your typical school space all through the day. And obviously there will be opportunities throughout the day, but they're not naturally inclined to experience so. We mentioned the concept of fatigue due to the more active processes, both physically and cognitively. And we also look at the idea that anxiety, that again, the feelings of low self-esteem and low self-image can impact with the areas of anxiety, as well as the impact on sensory processing, which can result in dysregulation or feelings of discomfort in certain settings. But as we said already, it's not just the physical, it's not just the moving, it's not just the coordination. Beneath the surface or beyond what we see, as we touched on already, the idea of executive functioning, which is our study, organization, but also the planning, inhibition, working memory, cognitive flexibility. All those higher order cognitive processes can be impacted and can impact on a number of different areas, as well as increasing dysregulation as a result. We mentioned fatigue, emotional regulation, and the ability to understand, interpret, and then react with emotions can be impacted, but that can also be impacted by our sensory regulation and how we interact with our environment and people around us and those stimuli that can impact areas. What I'll always say about sensory regulation is that everyone has a sensory profile. Be neurodiverse or neurodivergent or otherwise, everyone has a sensory profile. The person who seeks to go for a run every morning is seeking proprioceptive or deep muscle feedback. The individual who feels the need to chew chewing gum regularly might be seeking oral feedback. The person who dislikes certain frequencies might be experiencing auditory sensitivity. So everyone has a sensory profile. It just varies with individuals on how regulated that profile is and how significantly it impacts that individual. And I suppose we've touched on the idea of self-image and also then communication and how these individuals can receive information as well as express and sequence that verbal information. Also written information can be impacted. We don't have time to go in depth into the idea of regulation and those areas. But in general, the idea of regulation revolves around the idea of being in balance. In order to complete most tasks, we need to be in some form of balance, regulation, or homeostasis is the more complex term. Regulation will look different for everyone. For me, being regulated now, I'm talking at an even keel. I'm not high energy. I wouldn't say I'm low energy. I'm in a nice space. Some people, they may need to get really excited and bring up that level of energy to present, and that's how they work in. For some, they might need to relax and bring it down. So that regulation will look different for everyone and also will vary based on the task. Becoming regulated and how we get to that space is different. For some, it might be high energy activities. For some, it might be lower energy and calming activities. What we do for everyone, not just people who we say have sensory processing differences, but also anyone who has a sensory profile, which is everyone, is the idea that we trial strategies and review the effect. So, for example, I might have a drink of water and I find that alerting. I wouldn't find that very relaxing. Whereas if I say a nice cold glass of water, I find that alerting. Whereas I might have a nice chamomile tea, which I'd find relaxing or calming. So again, it's developing those strategies for each individual, develop that list and match the list with the desired result. Because if we go too far out of dysregulation, again, we won't go into too much about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, but essentially, if we're too outside of regulation, we can go into fight or flight, resulting in a significant internal reaction that we may not even be aware of at the time. Just quickly, we're going to have a look at the idea of task, demand, and dynamics. So when we look at the idea of a task analysis, we look at the idea of breaking down a task into smaller components. We look at where are the areas for success, the opportunities for success, the opportunities of challenge, what are the demands and how do they each occur? We look at, is there external components that might be involved, and so on and so forth. I'd often get groups to have a think about this area of which of these areas is the most dynamic or challenging for you as an individual, and which would be the least dynamic or the least complexity in this challenge. What we might do today, because it's a little bit shorter in the talk, is we might just kind of walk through the kind of dynamics that people have said in the past about these areas. We might start with the idea of playing tennis and work from right to left. When playing tennis, you're playing on a court, so you're within a confined space. You're working in horizontal lines with some movement backwards and forwards. You're working at a smaller ball than the other areas, but it's also a case of there's also an extremity. So that can be complex for some individuals in relation to the striking motion and the hand-to-eye coordination, but the general dynamics and the awareness of others is quite minimal. When we look at something like throwing a ball at a target from a cone, we are stationary. Our task is well defined. The target does not move, and we do not have a dynamic defender or a dynamic process other than retrieving the ball, really, and our own movement. So we're in control of that. When we look at playing football, we generally work in a 360-degree sphere of needing to turn around. We have a moving ball, moving players, technically moving targets when we say it's defend or attack and clear or strike. And so there's a lot going on. And the reason we look at this here is to consider a task. Sure, everyone plays football. Sure, why couldn't you play football? again, when you take in all those components and actually say there's a lot going on, the real reason we're looking at this here today is to kind of highlight that not everything that we say is expected for an individual or expected for a certain age is actually really should be expected, as really fair to expect of an individual. And this is, I'm looking at it through the lens of dyspraxia DCD, but in general, it works across all areas and of all backgrounds. There's a lot going on here, and if someone finds it challenging, that should be respected and either worked through or accepted. So just to have a quick recap and a reflection on what was covered during the talk, I suppose the areas that we looked to cover today is what is dyspraxia DCD, who does it affect, what do people with dyspraxia DCD present like, or what symptoms or what experiences may they have, and how does that impact them day to day. So hopefully most of you will see that these areas have been covered. But if you have any extra questions or anything that you need clarifying, we'll have a Q&A in 1 minute or so, and I'd be more than happy to answer any of those questions. Just some take-home points for everyone will be then, dyspraxia does not impact intelligence, does not impact IQ. It is different for everyone, no matter how common it may seem for some people. And that DCD, dyspraxia, it's not just physical. There's a whole unseen part under the surface, and there's much more than meets the eye. Some links for yourselves if you're looking for a bit of additional reading. Dyspraxia Ireland website, www.dyspraxia.ie, is a fantastic resource with lots of links and websites. Movementmatters.org, movementmattersuk.org is a fantastic website from the UK with lots of ideas. CanChild is a Canadian website that gives really clear information on dyspraxia DCD. A personal favourite of mine is the Kids Sense Child Development Australia website, where they give really clear layperson's terms for phrases, and I'd often use it if I come across a new phrase to clarify for myself. And then also childdevelopment.ca is a really nice website with different resources for different areas. So if anyone, that's the volume of my content. If anyone has any questions or has anything that they would like clarified from the talk, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thank you very, very much, Stephen, for your excellent talk. I mean, you really brought us through the key pieces and the key points that I think need to be made and elucidated in relation to dyspraxia DCD. And I know that there are some comments coming through on the chat as we speak, but also in the Q&A function. We invite everyone, if you can, to pop your questions into the Q&A function to ensure we get through them. I know Beth has to leave shortly, but Ken will be joining us in a moment to field some of those questions and to pass them to you, Stephen. If I may just ask one very brief question myself before bringing everyone else in. Stephen, I know there is dyspraxia, and you've explained it very well. Dysgraphia, which, as I understand it, can relate to writing, for instance. Do you have any, are there any linkages, or is this something that you would see interact with dyspraxia? Or am I maybe confusing two issues? Maybe I am.
No, it's a great question there. And I suppose dysgraphia it's a hard one to put into words. It's an overarching title. And if you were to go and look in, say, the DSM-5, which is in that diagnostic manual, it would be under the topic of a specific impairment in writing or literacy. So in relation to dysgraphia, you can have a diagnosis of dysgraphia without having a diagnosis of DCD or any other diagnosis. And what we'd be looking at if we were looking at that area would be handwriting speed, legibility, and maybe some of the other written components in that. Now, with dysgraphia, there's an educational piece, which means there's an educational psychologist requirement for some, and then there's also the functional piece of writing, which is the OT part. So it's actually a relatively tricky diagnosis to follow up on in that sense. So that's one part. Your main question really was, is there a link with dyspraxia DCD? And there is a relatively high link in both, but it's also quite difficult to segregate the difference between having an impairment in writing and having an impairment in motor coordination that impacts writing.
Well, thank you so much for fielding my question because, I mean, even part you added about the interaction between the profession of psychology and then, of course, the profession of OT is something which perhaps some people, myself included, may not have fully understood and appreciated. So thanks, Stephen. Uh, Ken, or indeed Beth, if you're still around. Ken, would you like to come in with some of our viewers' questions this
Indeed,
evening?
thanks, Dr. Stephen. It was a very interesting presentation, so thanks for that, and it does make it an awful lot clearer. Again, I go through the people's questions that I put in first, but I have a half dozen myself as well. And obviously, just if anyone does have questions, if they can pop them into the Q&A, we'll get them to Stephen as soon as we can. There's some coming through there now. So, the first one is interesting from Daniel. I have no experience of recognizing dyspraxia in real life. How would I see it, notice it? How would I differentiate it from that, oh, a person's moving weirdly? Is there any one point which one has, or can say a person has DCD?
Thanks, Ken. A very interesting question as well, Daniel, so thank you. I suppose when we look at the idea of DCD, the two main components is that there's a significant difference in coordinational ability, and then it impacts function. So I always use the example of, my handwriting is terrible. My mother always says I should have been a doctor, but I don't have a motor coordination difficulty. So I wouldn't fall into the category of DCD, even though there's a functional impact. Or vice versa, I may not be as coordinated, but it doesn't impact me functionally. I don't fall into that criteria. So there's really two questions. Is there a certain point that is the threshold? No, there's not. It's an overall picture. And if we were to look at an assessment of a person, we get the full background picture, because that informs an awful lot of it. So there's not, let's say, at one point where you step over the line and all of a sudden you have DCD. It's about the full picture. If you are looking to recognize it, the key areas we look for is what we look at: core coordination. So anything from the core, so moving the different parts of the body from the different sides, so legs and arms, that would be a key area. Being able to manipulate the hands and finger dexterity. So like one of the things we might look at is being able to pinch along our fingers fluidly like that. And then the ability to follow an instruction with one or multiple steps would be the kind of areas that would be our starting point. But again, that's only really scratching the surface.
You might not know the precise answer, but and you may know just the broader one on this. But any statistical overlap to AUDHD and DCD?
I suppose we wouldn't have specific statistics in relation to specific diagnoses. We just would have the overall neurodivergent diagnosis that there could co-occur at 40%, that if you have DCD, there's a 40% likelihood of having a second neurodiverse diagnosis.
Would, again, I mean, is when we talk about those other neurodiverse type conditions, we talk about autism, ADHD, dyslexia.
Yeah, dyslexia,
pretty common
dyspraxia.
between,
Yeah, all of those areas, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, all of those ones.
Thanks. Sue has a question. Thanks, Stephen. How does one go about obtaining an adult diagnosis?
A great question. And I suppose when we look at adult diagnosis, there's not currently a public adult assessment service, unfortunately. With the assessment process, the two key professionals would be an occupational therapist. And we do have a list of occupational therapists in Ireland who complete adult assessments. So if you're interested or know someone who's interested, we can be contacted at info at dyspraxia.ie, or if you can't remember that, or you can just go onto our website and there's a chat function where you can just put in the question, and our support staff will get back and highlight what OTs if you give us the area, we'll be able to tell you what OTs that be closest to you do adult assessments. And then the other piece is that we are doing work in relation to adult assessments, and Dorothy Armstrong has done a large piece in relation to training and educating other OTs in adult assessments. So that is an ongoing process that we hope to improve in the near future. So to answer your question, is an OT who does adult assessments and finding that, and then there'll need to be a medical follow-up, but in a lot of cases a GP would suffice in clarifying the final diagnosis.
So again, obviously, just one of the correlations there between ADHD and a condition like DCD is that and it's usually a psychologist or psychiatrist. So you'd be really saying for this, it'd be an OT backed up by a GP.
Yes, so the first three criteria can be completed by an OT, and the fourth and final criteria would be a GP, or in some cases a pediatrician or neurologist if it's an adult.
Ollie is asking much the same question about how to get it assessed, but she's also asking a question, and I think it may be interesting in terms of the perception of the condition. Can you go through your life and have DCD and not know it?
A really good question, and the answer to that in a nutshell is yes. That we work with a wide variety of ages of individuals, and I think we've had individuals 60 plus who've gotten diagnosis of DCD based on your life, the whole process, and what happened at later life. And it is something that I suppose we see in a lot of people, and because of the work ethic and the ability to disguise or cloak certain symptoms, they've worked incredibly hard without even knowing it. And it's only in later life when they realize X and Y didn't match up, and even despite areas. So yes, you can. We have seen plenty cases of people of variety of ages getting a diagnosis of DCD.
Just Neve has a couple of questions. We just put in one there. It was actually one of the ones I was going to ask, so I'll go straight to that one. Is it a genetic link to DCD?
So there's no scientific, factual, evidence-based information on this as of yet, but there would be very clear links in families that we'd see on a day-to-day informal basis without the information to back that up. So yes, there would be a higher than average likelihood that there is a familial trait of some form.
And there's a good question in from Anne. Probably need to go into a little bit of depth on this one, to be honest. What reasonable adjustments would you recommend for teachers of pupils who have children with DCD in the classroom?
A brilliant question, and I suppose there's not a one size fits all, but I suppose the first thing I would say is that pacing, that quite often it's actually just giving a bit more time, a bit more space to complete a task. And then also, I suppose, looking at what are the demands. We're going back to that task analysis. What are we expecting of this child to do throughout the day in line with his peers or her peers? And then also what we saw kind of during the pandemic and COVID years was that teachers were using alternative methods of response as they were working from home, and that we saw these kids really flourished with oral presentations, video pieces, art-based or creative pieces, much more so than writing, because writing was holding them back. So I suppose that would be kind of an overall tip on it. What I'd recommend if you're working with secondary school students, there's a fantastic resource on our website that highlights, this is the concern I have for this child, this is what I can do. And then also, I would always recommend looking at the Our Say in Our Schools resource, which is the experts, which were the kids themselves, who highlighted what they would like to see from teachers and educators.
And there's another question now, just on the same vein, but we approach it just a little bit differently. And so my son is 18 from Helen, and he's in 5th year, has dyspraxia, and he's done okay in school up to now, as he's bright, but never done much homework or any study. He's falling behind this year now, struggling to attend. Do you know any supports or coaches that could help? So maybe just two things taken out of that question. And usually when we talk about support in school, we talk about primary school, but here we're looking at somewhere around the leaving certificate cycle here in Ireland. But what external supports could you get? OTs, speech and language therapists, what's out there? What would you recommend?
So I suppose, firstly, it's always important to remember that, I suppose for me anyway, I grew up in the Irish system, and I learned by what I call chalk and talk, which was, it's written down, you write it down, you try and stick in your brain by reading it over and over again. That's not really the best way for most people to learn. But it's also a case of looking and saying, how do we learn best? Looking at that learning profile and what's going to suit that individual. The professionals that you might look at is some OTs do work in that sphere of executive functioning study skills, as well as you might consider discussing with your career guidance counsellor those areas, and then also educational psychology sometimes work in that sphere of study skills as well. There is a resource that some of our occupational therapy students have recently created on executive functioning and study skills, which looks at the ideas of regulation and being ready to learn, as well as the actual learning process. And that will be available off our website in the coming weeks. So probably in the next month, that will be available. It's a 6-week program that can be done either by a parent or by an educator or professional, which might be a nice starting point for that.
There was just one in the chat there from Daniel, and again, you were talking about dancing, and I was literally trying to type in, I hope Stephen never sees me dancing, but I again got it wrong. But Daniel was asking, could dancing be regarded as a form of training for improving neural circuits? Which would be a good thing if it did.
For improving which, sorry?
Neural circuits.
And I suppose, yes, and I suppose realistically, anytime we step outside our comfort zone into a space that we still feel safe in, we push the boundary a little bit, is often a chance to develop those skills. So I suppose when you think about dancing and the components, it's actually really complex. For some, it's natural and they don't need to think too much about it. Again, that active versus passive. But I would always go back to things like the Macarena, your Saturday nights, your cha-cha slides, where there's a really clear visual. And there's also a piece to move and work in as a starting point, rather than trying to learn off your Irish dancing or your cha-cha-chas or whatever you're doing. So I think, yeah, 100% there's a really nice component involved with dance that can support that.
Oh, thanks, Dan. I'm sorry for the bad Macarena there, but that's as I say, I am. Anyway. My son has DCD and ADHD. He really enjoys playing football with his parents and family, but organised sports seem to elicit anxiety in him. Is it possible that his response is due to how exhausting it is for him to play sports? He responds well when he has to write anything for school. So that's from Neve.
A great question, and something that we see very regularly. And I suppose when we're looking at the concept again, that task analysis of a game of football with the family, one, he's in a safer environment. Everyone has his back, as such, for want of a better phrase, that he's well looked after in that sense. And then it's also much smaller, and he's probably been through it maybe 100 times, 100 reps of anything he's doing there. When you go into the broader space, it's new, there's more time barriers, things have to happen in a certain way, there's greater expectations, there's greater chance of failure as well. If you think about playing football at home, no one's really going to chastise you for a little error in the back garden versus when you're on the pitch. And I suppose the phrase, you ruin it when you put medals up in front of people, is kind of the concept there as well, that idea of competitive sports is often something that we see as quite challenging. And it's interesting that you mentioned the idea of handwriting, because for handwriting, again, it's probably a case of there's a chance of failure, a feeling of lesser than, which can be quite negative. And I suppose when you say, where can we go? You're probably just looking at activities and events that can be high chance of success. Things like martial arts can be really beneficial. Things like Taekwondo, it's really structured. You mightn't even interact with another person, but you're doing your movements. And we'll save Ken doing his karate moves now, but it's a case of looking and seeing. It's similar to dance in that sense. You're learning a movement and replicating it. And trying to find an activity or sport. And I'd always recommend contacting your local sports partnership to see what events and activities are available in your area.
Thank you very much for that. Just a question just from Daniel, just again, we take it as a broader question, I think. You say he has ADHD, UDHD, he takes medication. What would you see is the, forgive me if I'm from ADHD, we do know that there can be medication for ADHD, but what's out there for people with DCD?
And I suppose there's not a medication as such, there's not a medical route in supporting DCD. There are certain co-occurrences that may require medical intervention. But what we see really, particularly with teens to adults to older adults area, it's the understanding that this is normal, that the expectation society have put on you and said, oh, you need to be able to do this, or tying a shoelace is, not being able to tie a shoelace is inappropriate for a 25-year-old, when in fact it's just a case of what's functional, what's a priority for me, and that's what's important, not what someone else has put in me. And we found that at our conference at the weekend, that the actual feeling of community of people of realizing their differences was a normal event. It just wasn't normal in other spheres by other people. So I suppose realistically, that comfort in what is appropriate for you is probably the most important thing for a lot of people.
Into a little bit more challenging territory. You mentioned the conference there that you were at last weekend, and you had 2 talks at it. Again, I was in and out myself just a couple of occasions. But there was an awful lot of expert speakers, talking about DCD as a condition. But one of the highlights of the day was the talk from the lived experience of the 3 people just after the break. They talked about the challenges of living with DCD and the mental health challenges that goes with that as well. Could maybe give us an insight into that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I 100% agree with you. The lived experience was really the highlight. And as I think I mentioned it myself in one of my talks, was people call me an expert in DCD, when in fact I've never walked a single minute in the shoes of someone with DCD. So I'm not the expert; they are the experts. In relation to the areas of impact, it's really interesting that when you look at the research and you look at the areas of impact for individuals or for parents of individuals, it's pretty much in line with societal norms in the preteen years, that it's the independent skills of, say, tying a shoe or a coat, then it goes to school-based skills, then it becomes more around sports. And as they move into the teen and adult area, it's much more about the mental health and well-being. I think we mentioned kind of the idea that a school day for an individual with dyspraxia DCD is complete with activities that aren't necessarily chances or opportunities for success. And the term, the idea of failure means first attempt in learning, kind of comes up a lot when we talk with people, and the idea that it's okay that if you make a mistake that you learn from a mistake, but if you're expected to do the same thing over and over again and not improve just because it's in a curriculum or if it's in a workplace environment that without considerations, that's really challenging, because all of a sudden now it becomes you who's the issue rather than the expectation of the task. So there is quite a regular co-occurrence of mental health concerns for some people, generally based on their experiences. But there have been signs that has been improving with greater understanding and greater awareness.
Just on the same point, just to maybe delve into that a little bit further, just in terms of the neurodiversity spectrum. And so again, in Ireland, you know, if you look at these people see behind me, we have the banner of ADHD Ireland, and you know, support, education, and acceptance is where we're trying to move to. But in terms of that acceptance, and in terms of that public perception, where do you think dyspraxia is in Ireland at the moment?
I think it's very fair to say that there's not enough public knowledge about dyspraxia, that dyspraxia DCD kind of comes into, when they hear it, they're aware that it falls into this neurodiverse sphere, but they're not really sure of what it means, or it's often just mixed up with dyslexia or other conditions. And I suppose when you look at it, I myself as a teacher didn't necessarily have a massive background in it, and that's kind of where we look at trying to ensure that as many people who can support others have as much knowledge as possible. And that's kind of one of our key targets, ensuring as much awareness as possible, getting it out into the spheres, making it a bit more mainstream, and really pushing towards that. Just the understanding, because realistically, that's going to be the main battle. If people understand what's happening, they can react and understand, whereas without understanding, it's a much greater challenge.
All the questions that have come in, there's a couple of questions from myself. So at this stage, I can possibly hand you back to Timmy.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Sure. So thank you, Ken, and thank you again to everybody who put in questions. And Stephen, I must say that, and again, I don't wish to what's the word, to patronize or in any way to appear as if I'm seeking brownie points. But I must say your delivery and your ability to convey points succinctly is very impressive. But that's not why you were here. Why you were here was to talk about dyspraxia DCD. And I think I speak for everyone here to say that we've really enjoyed your session, and it's been really informative and helpful. And also, more broadly, your pieces about, ensuring that young people or anybody can avail of events which are successful. That, as you say, failure is an opportunity to learn, but that we necessarily don't always, and we shouldn't necessarily expose children to experiences habitually which would set them up for failure. And I think it's been really, really informative here today on a broader perspective. And perhaps your professional background and additional qualifications and experience have really come to the fore as well. So, unless I see comments coming through, and they're all very, I think, positive and appreciative. So, unless you've any final comments, Stephen, we might.
One last quick question for Stephen,
Yeah.
just to wrap up. No, just this is an easy one. If there's a lot of questions there, thank you for looking for more information. So again, if someone was looking for more information on DCD, where did they go?
So I suppose I just want to say thanks a million to Timmy for his kind words there. Much appreciated. To answer your question, Ken, there in relation to if you have any other questions, info at dyspraxia.ie, or go to the Dyspraxia Ireland website and we have a query section there. You can just type it in and we've quite a good response rate, quite a quick response rate in those.
Thank you very much for that great presentation.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and thanks to everyone for their questions. Really made the talk, so thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen, and take care, everybody. We'll see you next month. And actually, just before we sign off, I know we have been discussing conferences. On behalf of Ken, myself, and our colleagues in UCD, Maynooth University Neurodiversity Hub, and the Institute of Neurodiversity, we're very pleased to let you know that we have a conference forthcoming on the 22nd and 23rd of May. And you can search for this conference and register for it on Eventbrite. The topic of the conference is neurodiversity and trauma. So exploring responses to neurodiversity and trauma, and how we can support people who have had such difficult experience. So that's just something that you may wish to consider. 22nd and 23rd of May, registration and attendance is online, and it's a free event, so do spread the word. Thank you very much again, Stephen and Ken and everyone. Take care.